The next presentation will be social benefits and implication of pavement preservation. We were going to have Larry Galehouse here, but he unfortunately couldn't make it today, so Judith has volunteered to give his presentation. You all met Judith yesterday. You know she is the new director, but I did want to read a little bit of her background. Prior to joining the National Center, she was with the North Carolina Department of Transportation for 26 years, and most recently served as a state pavement management engineer. She's been active in the Southeast Pavement Preservation Partnership oversight panel for many years, and she's currently the chair for TRB's Standing Committee on AHD 18 Committee on Pavement Preservation. So please again, welcome Judith.
I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might define societal impacts. That's a very personal thing. You know, it's not like there's a book that clearly defines this. Talk a little bit about the historic context. Larry had done a great job on this. He sent me what he had put together, and he really focused on this historic context. So I'm going to show you some of those, so you're getting a little bit of Larry and a whole lot of Judy in one presentation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about impact. You know, when we say what is the impact of pavement preservation on various societal impacts, talk a little bit about long-term impacts, and then finally just a few conclusions. There is no right answer on this particular topic. Some of the historic challenges here when we start trying to discuss some of these impacts are the incredible diversity across the country. We have very different physical regions, different climates. And each one of those regions, I am here to tell you, thinks they have their own best answer to pavement preservation, and they deal with whatever societal impacts are prevalent in their region. I've learned a huge amount from being at this Northeast meeting, having been at the Southeast meeting for many years. So it's very interesting. Not only are we diverse as far as our geographic and climate effects, we are also diverse in terms of how our populations are spread out. And this impact, this population density impact, increases over time moving forward. If you look at the 30 to 50 year projections, the whole East Coast becomes a solid blob of the maroon color. And California and up the West Coast, right at the coastline, becomes another maroon blob. But in the vast middle, we remain incredibly rural and very low population density, and that's a challenge to fund, to do the work, and to keep road networks that connect across these two very different population densities. And then I would be remiss when we talk about pavement preservation to not point out the well-known fact that we have not really done an effective job at consistently making the case for real increases in funding. We have gotten some incremental increases in funding, but at the same time this is going up, the consumer price index is also going up. Materials prices are going up, and so the real purchasing power has been going down. The Highway Trust Fund has been the federal pot from which we hope to maintain, build, or at least build our systems. The Highway Trust Fund contributes about 1/4 of all the highway and transit spending. But we have been dipping into the general fund for 3/4 of highway and transit spending in recent years. The Highway Trust Fund no longer is sustainable for maintaining, and I don't mean maintaining as in maintenance, I'm for the infrastructure as we have it. Okay, and then we know about 40% is diverted to non-highway and non-transportation purposes. Anybody in a state agency knows about diversions and picking up incidental things that need to be funded, but that are really not the infrastructure itself. And of course, they did pass some legislation that delays insolvency to 2020, but those of you who are my age or older know that 2020 is an eye blink away. You know, this is, the older you get, the faster the time seems to go by. 2020 is no time at all from now. Everyone with gray hair just shook their head. It's an involuntary response, but nevertheless, it is true. Now, I gotta say, 27 states have raised additional revenue since 2012. Now, one of those states is my home state of North Carolina, and while they raised revenue, they did not raise revenue enough, and they raised revenue with all kinds of strings attached. So there are funding increases, and then there are funding increases, and I'll just leave it at that. Some of these states really did, in fact, pass some meaningful increases in funding. Iowa is one example that I happen to know that they actually significantly improved their funding situation. Don't you love pictures of old feds? I mean, it was like they came with a uniform, you know, kind of the, that's a picture taken at the dedication of the first federal aid project. They put up a big sign. It was interesting. So historically, the Federal Highway Administration has funded construction of interstate. And it was very clear in their guidance that state and local governments were to fund maintenance and operations of those road systems. And that remains to this day, though there is some wiggle room depending on who you're talking to and what their pet projects are, what their attitudes are about this. So that all is the historical concept behind what I'm going to talk about now, and that is societal impacts. Well, what are those societal impacts? Those are impacts on how we live, how we make a living, how we travel, where we go for recreation, and how we interact with the world around us. It also includes the broader issue of climate and sustainability. So there's a little bit of everything in here. This is not, after the laboratory testing presentation just before this is a little bit of culture shock. Sorry about that, but this is really more, think of yourself as a planner. This is their kind of presentation. So, nevertheless, if you think back to unpaved roads versus paved roads broadened, enlarged the circle that people could travel to work. For the people in the room, how many of you commute more than 20 miles each way to work? Okay, how many of you, and I'm in that category as well, how many of you commute more than 30 miles each way to work? I'm in that category. Okay, so it's more than half of the people who commuted more than 20 miles each way to work commute more than 30 miles each way to work. Without paved roads, that is out of the question. Without maintained roads, that is possible but undesirable, very undesirable. And then you get to this question about buying a home. In the Wake County where I used to work, there were subdivisions that did pavement preservation on their roads, but there were also subdivisions that did nothing. That decision to not provide preservation or maintenance impacts the selling price and the time to sale for every home that's in that subdivision. And that is really where you hit the average homeowner right in their pocketbook. They may not understand preservation. They may not understand what you're doing or what a particular treatment is, but they will understand a negative impact on the selling price of their home or the time it would take for them to sell. So those are real societal impacts. Preservation allows our taxes for road maintenance to remain low. Now, you could make the case they're too low, and I would certainly agree with you, but nevertheless, if you ask the average citizen, do you want to raise taxes to pay for road maintenance? You may get it to pass, but you may not, and that would explain why there's only 20 states that have gotten real increases in funding. I think another important aspect that we fail to vocalize is the expectation of our citizens for emergency services. They expect an ambulance to come to their door, to their driveway. Heck, we expect Amazon to get there. We expect FedEx to get there. So we certainly, if we're having a stroke where the first 11 minutes are critical to your recovery, you want to know that your emergency service will get there. That is a frequently overlooked benefit of road maintenance and preservation. And I already mentioned Amazon, but just-in-time delivery applies to more than just Amazon. I mean, Amazon is kind of the poster child for just-in-time delivery. But the reality is that when I was young in my career, we spent a lot of engineering effort building huge warehouses outside cities. And from those giant warehouses, things would be distributed to the local community. You don't see those giant warehouses going up very much anymore. Now, trucks serve as moving warehouses. The materials go directly from the manufacturer onto a truck. The truck is in transit just according to the delivery requirements of the particular salesperson, and there is no warehouse. And that is why if something is not available at your locally, it means it may be coming all the way across the country, because those warehouse distribution centers are much less prevalent. We've already hit on this, but when you talk about commuting, you're not just talking about miles. You're also talking about the maintenance of your vehicle, the wear and tear on your vehicle. You hit a pothole and you're almost guaranteed to need a tire alignment. You may need a new tire and a new rim. And an unmaintained road is less safe. So we all know these things. I'm just trying to enumerate the things that we all know. There's been a lot of studies recently on generational differences in our population. And I read once that people who came back from World War II, they were happy to have whatever job they could get, and they would stay at it for 40 years. Time moves on, another generation comes along. The late 60s, they characterize as people in search of themselves. And I am one, so I understand where that comes from, but it was a different philosophy. Nevertheless, as far as their work life was concerned, people in the late 60s and into the 70s did in fact tend to go to work and stay with an employer, maybe not as long as the preceding generation, but certainly for a long time. In fact, when I was in college, we were cautioned not to ever change jobs unless you had at least 1 year at an employer. No matter how awful it is, no matter how much you hate it, stay for a year. How many other people heard that? Anybody? Yeah, it was common. It was really common. If you fast forward a couple generations, the young generation now, they do not hold those old truisms. They are expected to change jobs every 5 years. And if you can't provide that upward mobility every 5 years, they'll leave the organization. So we're going to have to all adjust. That adjusting, that job changing, is in fact reflected in mobility. And the younger generation has a very high expectation for mobility. So the good roads are both key to opportunities and to quality of life. And I'm going to get more into quality of life. How do people define quality of life? Well, you have to be able to make a good living, you have to be able to find housing at a reasonable price, you have to have time and opportunities for recreation. That, number 3, is very key for the millennials. They are looking for work-life balance. You get to the 50s and over set, we're looking for healthcare facilities. The older you get, the number of miles to the nearest hospital decreases. Community services, good water, low crime, good schools. We want good community services. And then social and religious outlets, just to round out some of the items in quality of life. So we don't travel just to work. We travel for recreation, for visiting families. 40% of the families in the U.S. traveled 50 miles or more for the 4-day Thanksgiving weekend, or some portion thereof. That is a huge number of people on the road, on airplanes, traveling. If our roads are not maintained and preserved, it increases the number of accidents, it increases the congestion, it decreases the speed. It's a very complex thing that keeps all those vehicles moving. Even when we travel by other modes, I love to take the train. But when I travel by train, I still drive 30 plus miles to the train station. I still park my car. And preservation of parking spaces is another area of preservation that we really don't think about very often and is frequently overlooked. Travel destinations are also needing to be preserved. How many of you visited a national park this year? Anybody? I know we work all the time, but a good handful of people did. Each park has its own road system. And those road systems are not well funded for maintenance. They put their money into customer visitor programs and that kind of thing. And so we really do have issues with maintenance, particularly on state parks, but even the national parks are at risk. And then I do have to point out that when we travel, we want to bring essentially our home quality of life with us on the road. And some of the travel recreational vehicles are at a higher standard of living than I live at. So we camp in style now, and that requires a lot of infrastructure. So, and it doesn't stop there. When I started this presentation, I thought I'm going to struggle to hit 15 slides on this topic. As I started working on it, more and more ideas kept coming to me. How many of us have kids who have participated in regional sports teams? Very common, yeah. When you have a kid in one of these leagues, you're traveling over a 3-state or 4-state region for their weekend competitions. And it's over an extended season. So it's a real commitment. I'm not saying it's not valuable, but I'm saying this is a lot different from the old Pop Warner leagues that I knew as a kid, where it was just at the neighborhood schoolyard and everybody walked. We haul our boats, we haul our campers, we go across country and across state. And similarly, as adults, we participate in activities that are now over a much broader geographic area. I included hunting here because I'm trying to be inclusive. I don't know anything about it, but I do know that friends of mine at North Carolina DOT used to participate in lotteries to get tags to hunt in Colorado, Wyoming, and Alaska every year. And if they won the lottery, they were off for a hunting trip. I'm a quilter. I am guilty of traveling around just like the hunters do. I tried to get a meeting set for Paducah, Kentucky, and my colleagues from Kentucky DOT said, "What the heck? Nobody wants to go to Paducah." It was on my bucket list, and I did go 2 years ago to National Quilt Fest when 30,000 quilters arrive in Paducah, Kentucky. 30,000 middle-aged women with cash. Yeah, we were really treated well by Paducah. Apparently, we pay for the town of Paducah for the year in that 1 week. Similarly, Houston, Texas is another destination of choice, and there are many others. And no matter what your pastime of choice is, there are similar venues that you might want to go to away from home. So we do a lot of this kind of stuff. We have travel destinations, Disney World, Universal Studios, Las Vegas. I'm sure there's a zillion others. And then we have regional destinations, the beaches, the well-known museums, mountain resorts, and so forth. Each one of them is a traffic generator. Each traffic generator increases the need for good quality roads and maintenance. So I thought, well, I need to get this a little bit more personal. So I thought about one Sunday dinner at my house. I have 4 children, 3 of them live locally. For one son, it's 36 miles to my house. One daughter and her husband and their daughter, 5 miles. The other son, 20 miles. One grandson, 130 miles. He's trying to break away from his mother, so, 130 miles seemed good to him. So nevertheless, I guess the point is 191 miles one way for one family for one Sunday dinner. Now, do the math and multiply it out. It does add up. Okay, and then I want to talk just very briefly about interaction with the world, the climatic effects. Poor roads use more resources to reconstruct. I don't need to go into all this. I know you all know this. Poor roads result in higher vehicle operating costs, lower fuel efficiency, more rapid tire wear. I heard a very interesting discussion out in the hall about bicycle paths and glass as a partial replacement aggregate, and having to undo that because of tire wear and tire punctures. So, you know, these things hit on all levels. And then more frequent vehicle replacement. Poor roads result in slower travel speeds and increased congestion. So, let's say we're just going to do rehab treatments. And that, unfortunately, is common still in some areas. Well, let's say we're going to use the very typical 20% recycled materials in the treatment. It's pretty common, a hot mix with 20% recycled materials. But frequently, before we put down that asphalt, we're going to mill up 1.5 inches. So we're going to generate more RAP than we put in to do the rehab. We have now increased the waste pile and used a lot of virgin materials. If instead we're able to do a preservation treatment, even if it's a double treatment, we're going to use emulsion, asphalt, maybe some polymer modified. We will be generating almost no waste material, assuming that we get the maintenance crew, or the crew doing the work, to not put down excessive aggregate. As long as we can control that aggregate application rate, we don't generate much waste material. It isn't just the materials you use in construction, it's the process by which that material is obtained that plays into the sustainability of a particular product. I'm sure most of you are aware that Portland cement, making the Portland cement, is the vast majority of the energy usage associated with laying a concrete pavement. It's the production of the cement that is the killer. Similarly, the process of getting asphalt out of the ground is also a very high energy user. And I, of course, am not on the right slide. Oh well, it doesn't matter. So we all, these things are very, very linked. For example, we know our chip seals perform best with a uniform rock size and relatively clean material. But single-sized rock production creates mountains of waste at quarries. It's a problem. The quarrying of rock itself is a very high energy expenditure. And the process of making lightweight aggregate, while it is a high energy activity, it does produce that single or nearly single-sized material and relatively clean. So now I get to the asphalt. Think back to the pictures you've seen of the North Dakota oil fields, where you see 200 tractor trailers in a circle around a wellhead. and they're all running. That's the part that people don't, they aren't parked. They all have their engines on, and they're running because they are actually generating the electricity to run the pump. So those several thousand vehicles traveled on very low volume roads, many of which are destroyed in the process of drilling a single well. How does preservation help? This is just a few last thoughts on preaching to the choir. When you do preservation activities, small cracks are filled, the water, you tend to seal off the surface, and the asphalt below it is protected. When you keep the water out, you tend to reduce potholes, you also tend to reduce delaminations, and then, at least in most areas, the new aggregate, the chips, provide good surface friction. Usually associated with preservation, we're doing some secondary activities like some drainage work and other paint striping and so forth, so that the public gets a significantly safer road system. As a result of this, we all do all of those societal activities, the going to work, going to school, going to sports events, going on vacation, participating in civic affairs, all the things that we think of as normal life without ever thinking about it. And that's what we want. That is the goal. We want people to be able to do those things without thinking about it, and at the same time, we want them to be willing to pay for it. That is the real challenge. Thank you. I've enjoyed it. Are there any questions or comments?
I was just wondering if there's any work that's known of going into quantifying some of these benefits that are intangible. I mean, at the university level, of course, or whatever.
I'll have to look into that, but I will look into it and see. I'm not aware of that much. Now, there are some areas where, yes, there has been work done. On the freight delivery side, our colleagues in the freight industry have done a lot of work on trying to quantify benefits of being able to travel at different speeds, both on their vehicles and on their drivers. So they're really bottom line conscious. So I know there's data there, but on some of the other items, not so much. But it is an area where we need to, because this is how we can communicate what we're trying to accomplish to citizens. So that's a good point. Thanks very much.
Thank you.